Cool? Okay, cool. Hey, there you go. Hey, how's it going? Hey, 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 hey! All right. I'm from America, so Fonzie's a cultural icon. Yeah, like was said, my name's Patrick. I'm here today to talk about progressive web apps. Excuse me. Who here has heard of progressive web apps? Oh, it's beautiful. Okay, so this is, so basically progressive web apps is kind of like a made-up marketing term, just so that we all know what the hell we're talking about. There's a whole bunch of new APIs that have come to the web in the past few years, and I want to try and show you guys some of the new ones and also some of the stuff you might have missed from before. But before we dive into that, like I said, I work at Edge, so if you have any complaints or questions or requests for Edge, feel free to hit me up. If you have any complaints about IE, I can't do anything for you because no one works on it anymore. But you know, I'm happy to commiserate. This is me. If you look me up on the internet, despite this shirt, I do work at Microsoft. It's the avatar I use everywhere. I just have cakes every year for my birthday. I have like a theme. It's because my partner, Katrina, makes them for me every year. A lot of times she'll come with me to conferences. She didn't come with me on the past couple because we had a baby. And thank you. Applause is appreciated. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's the only applause break I ever get. Yeah, and what's funny is it's both of our first child. And it was funny when we had them, everybody warns you a bunch. I don't know who here has had a child, but everybody kind of tells you, like, get sleep while you can, or, you know, eat while you can, or your life's going to change. And it really wasn't the case with us, because he was like an easy mode baby. He's the most chill dude I've ever hung out. Like, he actually got really sick at one point. He's fine now, but they almost didn't let him into the hospital because he was so smiley. He had like 102-degree fever, and he was all like, hey, everybody's like, he's a really relaxed baby. He's fine now. He's a lumberjack. Excuse me, we're from Seattle, so it's like the two options that are available. Is web developer or lumberjack, and he didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps. But yeah, he's a chill baby. He smiles all the time. The only time he ever gets upset, though, is when we go on like car trips. If you ever have to put him into a car seat, he gets like really grumpy, doesn't like being strapped down, I guess. And you know, at first that's fine when we first brought him home, but after a couple of months of having a baby at home, it got a little stir crazy. And so we decided we wanted to go up to Vancouver, which is some mountain areas in Canada. If you're unfamiliar with where I live in Seattle, which is up here. Vancouver is just above there. And so, you know, this was our first big road trip leaving Seattle with our kid, and it was a little bit stressful. And so I was like, I didn't know what to do, so I did what most people do. They go on the internet and figure it out. And after a little while, I found a video that was kind of weird. It was these dots on YouTube, and this is it. This is the whole thing. It was dots on YouTube, but that immediately stopped him crying every single time I showed him. Instantaneously, it's this weird trick. It's like this one weird trick you'll never believe. You know, doctors hate him. It actually is one weird thing. You can check it out. And what's weird is, I don't know how it works, but it says something with like the contrast and the motion. It just basically makes the baby forget why they were crying. And then they're just like, oh, there's motion, hooray. So, you know, I got him in the car, and he stopped crying, showed it to him, and we drove up. And it was cool. You know, it was Canada, so it was all cold. And we got to walk around and have fun, and he slept most of the time. And after, you know, we spent the whole day up there. We decided to go back, and, you know, I freaked out because I put him in his car seat again, and I was like, I got you. And I pulled up my video, and I got this. And for a while, because it was a YouTube video, and I was in Canada, and I didn't really have cell signal, and I felt like an idiot because I was like, crap, I have a really slow connection. My cell service up there is only like 2G at best. I was just really angry because, you know, like I had this video that, I mean, my baby was just screaming, and my partner, Katrina, was angry at me because I was like, I have this perfect trick, and you know, one weird trick, and it was a lie, apparently, and nothing worked, and everyone was grumpy. And so, you know, I was mad. And eventually we get back to the border, and I get, you know, American cell signal again, which is better for me. And, you know, after a little while, while I was stewing in the car and driving, I kind of thought about it more. It wasn't that, and the video popped up, it wasn't that 2G ruined my day. It was that 45 megabytes ruined my day. Like, there was no reason for me to really rely on this video that was 45 megabytes just to make my baby stop crying. I could have pre-downloaded, but even more to the fact, like, it's just dots on a page. I'm a web developer. I could have done this myself in way less than 45 megabytes, unless I'm using like a bunch of Webpack or something. But that was a joke for Sean, sorry. And so anyway, I got grumpy, and I was like, man, I feel like a bad developer. So I got back home, and I thought about, how I wanted to make the situation better. So I opened up Vim, and I ended up just staring at it for like an hour because I have no idea how SVG works, and I have to figure out, I literally couldn't remember how to make a circle in SVG. And so I have this kind of self-motto: when I can't figure out what to do, I just buy a really stupid domain for something, and eventually I'll think of something better to do with it. And so that's what I did. I came up with Hush Little Baby, because I like domain hacks. And it works. It's really cool. And so you can check it out. You have the exact same video effect as you do, but in SVG in less than 6K. Eventually I figured out how SVG works. But to make sure I never had that really slow loading thing happen again, I wanted to dig in and really make this a progressive web app. I wanted to make it work, offline and fast and all this other stuff. And so first step to that, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is adding a service worker. Now, a service worker for this case, is pretty straightforward. All we're doing is really caching a few static assets that we're pretty much known before we even start. And so in order to get that working, we have a install event, which is effectively when the service worker is loaded in the browser for the very first time. We can go out and download a whole bunch of files that we know are going to be used, and then have them stored offline and available immediately. That way we don't have to wait for them to be initially requested. It's kind of like priming the cache. And so we listen for that install event, and then we wait until it happens. We wait until we open our caches. There's a cache object inside of a service worker that lets you cache files. It gives you a control over everything. Instead of relying on the browser cache, you can actually store something in a key value pair inside of the browser that you can check whether or not it's actually there. It works great. And so we wait until we open that cache, and it's a promise, so it has a then on it. So once that has been opened, we get that cache reference, and then we do an add all call, which is just exactly what it sounds like. We add all of the URLs that are up there in our prefetch cache up at the top. It's just a list of URLs. In this case, it's just that totally rad sans font. And then for each one of those URLs, we just fire off a new request, which is a subset of the fetch API. It's basically like fancy Ajax. And we get it. And so what this is doing is just going through an array of URLs and then adding it to a cache. And so with those like 10 lines, you have a website that will probably work pretty much offline immediately. And then you also have a fetch event, which will be anytime anything goes to the network and is not immediately served by your service worker, by other parts of your code, you can kind of catch it and then shove it into your cache later on in case we forget about it in our prefetch or if we add files later on. So we just check to see if any network request matches something that already exists in our cache. If it is, we serve that. Since it's a simple web app, we can just have stuff serving immediately. And if it's not, we just fall back. We say, okay, go ahead and fetch that new thing, and then we'll shove it into our cache later on. And so it works. It was awesome. And I was super excited because it only took me like 3 hours, including like 2.5 hours to figure out how SVG works. And everything functioned, and I was stoked. And so I was in my house, which looks like this. It's an apartment in Seattle. And I was really excited. I called over my partner, Katrina, and I told her to like pull out her phone and check it out. And she did, and she got this, which was a bummer because she has an iPhone because she's cool. And you don't really have service worker support on the iOS devices, which sucks. It's like as much as I love progressive web apps, as much as I love service workers and Android and Chrome and everything else, it's not everywhere, and it's coming. A lot of places are going to have it soon. Hopefully, including Safari. It's definitely coming in Edge, but we're not there, and so it's a bummer. But that wasn't really acceptable to me to just have an app that didn't work on her phone because it's to help our baby. Like, I need to have it work on all phones that are going to affect my baby. And so I was looking into other features that might be useful that actually work on the iPhone, and I had a terrible idea. It was to try out App Cache. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are here that had that reaction to the word App Cache are probably familiar with this talk, which is Jake's talk, App Cache is a douchebag. And it really is. Has anybody here ever not heard of App Cache? Any couple of people? Okay, so basically it's a douchebag. It is an API that exists in the browser that is terrible. It was a fall off of the Google Gears project way back when. If you ever had to store your MySpace messages offline, it was made for that. So it's old, and it's not very good. Service workers are way better. In fact, kind of referencing Mike's talk, it's actually trying to be removed from the HTML specification, and hopefully from browsers. It's one of the only features that is actively being petitioned to be removed from the spec because people hate it so much. But in this particular case, it covers our use case. And not only that, it actually has really good support. So it's a terrible API that's shipping everywhere, much like everything Mike talked about. And as a result, we can use it to have an offline web application or have some offline assets at the very least. And so we do a little bit of feature detection where obviously we want to support service workers first if that's available. And then otherwise we fall back to app cache. And so for those who are unfamiliar, if you ever want to use an app cache, you have to set an attribute on the HTML tag. It's not like a service worker where you register it in JavaScript. You actually have to set that manifest tag. And what's a bummer about that is that you can't set that dynamically. Like you can't go into JavaScript and add that tag. If you do that, the app cache never gets loaded on that page. And so that makes this part where we add app cache kind of a tricky thing. And what I ended up doing to get it to work is basically creating an iframe, display it none, and then append that to the page. You just have a really thin document that is only an app cache manifest, effectively. And then you append that iframe, and because iframe's terrible, it actually takes control of the existing parent web page if it's on the same domain. And so literally you just have this page. That's all it is a HTML document that I have inside that iframe. And then it has that offline.appcache file that looks a little bit like this. Cache manifest has to say cache manifest up at the top because douchebags like to hear their own name. And then you have a list of assets. You have to list out every single individual asset that has to be unique, and it will always return the exact thing it gets for that asset every single time. So it's really, you have to make sure that it works, basically, and that your build process works. And then on top of that, you have to include the network asterisk tag, because if you don't, it will assume everything that wasn't in your asset list doesn't exist on the web, and so it'll just 404, and it's a horrible API, basically. But the cool thing is that it took our website on that slow connection inside of my brick apartment with a whole bunch of bad walls where Katrina didn't have signal from about 20 seconds to where we could get it in to 190 milliseconds. And so what it was doing was just loading all those assets directly from disk. It was just the same thing that Serviceworker does. It's just it's an API that's existed for a while that's in older browsers. And so, yes, AppCache is a douchebag, but it's existed for a while, and it can kind of be a douchey friend until we can get over to the Serviceworker world. As long as you know the problems that are inherent in these old and terrible APIs and you feature detect for them properly, they're okay to use. Just don't rely on them forever and get rid of them whenever you can. Make Mike happy. Now, I was kind of, I felt dirty when I made a app cache website, and so I decided to get even deeper into the mud. Does anybody here ever remember HTAs besides Chris? Yeah, besides Chris? Okay, cool, yeah. HTAs were Hypertext Applications, is that right, Chris? Chris Wilson down here works at Google. He created all the problems in CSS. He was actually the first engineer to ship CSS in a browser, actually. He's a very impressive person. He deserves a round of applause. Well, he's talking after me. I meant then, but that's fine now, too. So yeah, anyway, Hypertext Applications were these basically Microsoft's attempt to have offline web applications 20-something years ago. If you've ever used the help dialog in old Windows, those were all HTAs. And so anyway, I made my website an HTA. And so if you go there and you download it, you'll get this horrible bar because why the hell is anyone using old IE? And you get this download, and you get a prompt, and you get a custom little icon in the corner, and you get this whole little packaged web application that is offline and works, and it's great, and it runs on my grandparents' computer. And they really have a Windows 98 computer. It's depressing. But yeah, basically, it's terrible, and you should never ever do this because it's stupid. But the whole point is that PWAs are not just a radical way to create a new website. It's also a radical way to update a website. There was nothing stopping me from guessing what these APIs looked like 20 years ago and shipping that, except for my bedtime. And you could have made all this code and have it just progressively lit up over the coming decades as those features were rolled out. I could have shipped an HTA with Serviceworker support back then and had it. You shouldn't be afraid to start working with these APIs, even if they're only in one browser. Because as long as you do proper feature detection and you're willing to update it with the spec ever changes, you can use really exciting APIs today, and you can actually control the way that web browsers and web specs evolve, because web browsers are kind of starved for information. And it's not all new new APIs. There's some old ones. Can I get it? Web workers, anybody? No? It's been around since 2008, thank you. 2008, which is insane. I work on Edge. We used to look like this in 2008. It was a really long time ago. This was IE 7, if memory serves. And yeah, 2008 is insane. That was Chrome version 2. It's a really long time ago. It's insane. It's nearly a decade. But no one knows what web workers are for the most part. Most developers have never used it. So just a quick refresher, if you're unfamiliar, big problem with the web if you're developing if you're doing a lot of feature work on the web, is that everything's single-threaded. Because you might be able to statically update the DOM at any point in your JavaScript. You can't necessarily check for the layout of something. And if you've ever had a scroll handler, you'll know that it gets really janky really quickly. And it's because everything's fighting for the same CPU time. The browser can only do one thing at once. And so if you ever have a function that's really complex, or you do a lot of feature work at once, you get really janky, gross interactions. Like you have, if you've ever implemented a scroll handler, you've probably seen how painful it gets really, really quickly. So what web workers allow us to do is to offload these things to a background thread. And so basically, you have a new JavaScript context where you can execute JavaScript code, but you don't have access to a lot of the DOM APIs, ways that you can actually, all the different ways that web browsers wouldn't let you run your code asynchronously before because it might interact with the DOM, you can now do because you basically say, I don't need access to any of this. I just need to do a whole bunch of JavaScript. As a result, super expensive functions become really, really cheap because they're in their own thread. They don't interact in the DOM, and so you can solve these silky smooth animations and do these really complex calculations over here. And even better, the support's bananas, like everywhere except for Opera Mini, which, it's Opera Mini. Supports, Mike doesn't work there anymore, so I don't have a problem insulting them. Yeah, no, it works everywhere. Like they've been around for 10 years, nearly 10 years. And so you can do a lot of really fun, weird things with it. For example, like Matthias said, I work on Modernizer. I made their website, our website. And when we first shipped it, Modernizer 3, we became a modular thing. It used to be one big file, and we made it so that you could check off features, because when people would add that one big file, they would never actually need almost any of the feature text. They'd need like 4 of them, and as a result, we were kind of bloating the web. We were shipping all these features that a lot of people didn't need, and so when we designed the website, we wanted to make sure people were really cognizant and aware of the weight of their websites, how heavy things were. And so we have this little checkbox thing where it keeps track of all the different things you check, and it tells you how large that file is. In addition to that, we actually say on the right-hand side how large the gzipped file is, because we actually we inherited rather, a gzip implementation and loaded it in the web worker, and then every single time you do a new feature, we will do a full build in a different web worker, send that over to a gzip, compress it, and then send back the result. And all that can happen in probably like 50 milliseconds, which is really fast for the UI to update as far as that information, but it's really slow if you were actually blocking that interaction, that checkbox. Every single time you check something off, it would be really slow and gross. And so we're able to have really fast interaction and make it still scroll pretty and make everything look really nice and feel fast and fluid, but have this extra information that makes people aware that they might be adding too much weight to their website. And it was fairly straightforward to implement. You can do all kinds of stupid stuff with web workers. I have this other project, Web Worker Preprocessor, which is, if you ever use, has anybody here ever heard like CodePen or JSPen or any of those things? Yeah, they're really cool. I use them all the time. On my job, I do a lot of interop work, and so I reduce a lot of bugs on the web. So like people will say like, why is this website not working? And so I'll kind of rip all that code, put it into like a CodePen, and reduce all the code to make it really, really small. Or if we're working with new features like CSS custom properties or variables, we'll start playing in CodePen to make all kinds of neat stuff. And so one of the things that bummed me out is that a lot of those websites don't work offline, and I travel a lot, and a lot of times I'm offline. And so I made this project so that we could have, theoretically, some of those languages work offline and work in a web worker. So we have stuff like Less, Slim, Pug, Jade, pretty much anything that you could have on these websites have been transpiled into JavaScript, and they can run inside of a web worker. In fact, one of the more larger projects was SAS, and we actually have that working. You can go to offlinesas.club, because I love stupid website names, and you can run this. So this is an offline app. If you can tell, I am in airplane mode down here, And we can actually change our slash on the corner and change it to, oh no, sorry. It's really impressive from my end, I tell you. Hold on. Let me get my display properties up. Thank you for whoever said that. Can we get, nope, okay. No. Oh, I know why. There you go, okay. Comic Sans, okay. And so we can just run compile, and that recompiles the whole page, and I don't remember how to do Comic Sans in font, so my font joke fails. But you can have this entire Ruby runtime, so this actually completely transpiled the Ruby programming language, Sass, and all of the components required to make that work. It's running inside of a web worker completely offline. You can have the entire other programming languages running within another JavaScript context of your browser, and it can run incredibly quickly. All that compilation, that giant piece of, code executes almost instantaneously. And again, this is completely offline. And so you can have all that sort of feature work happen in web workers. And this is features that have existed on the web for, again, nearly 10 years. You can check it out if you want. It's really dumb, but it's kind of fun. And then you can also do much more practical stuff. This is Pokedex.org. It sounds silly, but this is from Nolan Lawson. He's one of the perf members on the Edge team. Excuse me. And he actually did this really cool thing with this. It's literally just a list of Pokemon. But what's cool is he actually implemented it using a React-like library called Virtual DOM, which is just all that DOM diffing that you would normally do basically with React. I assume most people are familiar, but you can have an object that represents all the different state of your application, like what things are being shown, whether or not stuff is clicked. And then whenever your user interacts with it, it checks what the new state is, diffs it, and then creates the smallest number of HTML changes possible. And so all that logic normally happens in that same UI loop that we normally are trying to avoid with web workers. That's the whole point. And so he actually added virtual DOM inside of the web worker. And so all that heavy DOM diffing and that sniffing code that has to be done to check stuff, he actually implements it in here. And as a result, he gets 60 frames per second on a Galaxy S, which is like a 6-year-old phone, which is insane. Like, the scrolling performance is ridiculous. And no one's incredibly smart and talented, but this is not a complex thing to implement. He documented it really well. And even then, a lot of the features are basically just there. You can do a sniff for web worker support. You can start to do it today on a website if you've ever done anything with DOM diffing, and it will be really, really pretty performant. In fact, the React team themselves are investigating bringing all of React into a web worker whenever it's available. You can check out how he did that on the Pokedex website itself. And then there's also all kinds of weird old APIs, like Indexdb. Has anybody here ever used Indexdb? I'm so sorry. Like, Indexdb is really painful. It's one of those things that have been around for a really long time. It's added to Mozilla, gosh, I think like 2008 as well, or no, that's not right, a long time ago. And it's kind of a part of that extensible web manifesto. The whole point was that we wanted to have a really low-level primitive for database-like structures on the internet. The problem is that most web developers, myself included, want to use APIs like this, where you have just key values pairs. I just want to set a value and then get that value later on. The problem, if you want to implement something like this in Indexdb, is it looks like this. That's not a joke. That's actually what you have to do to ship this in a feature today. To polyfill this within this, you have to do it. And it sucks. I mean, like, Indexdb is obviously not meant to do stuff as trivial as this. It's meant to do much larger feature work, but at the same time, it's complex and it sucks. Like, don't try and zoom in because it's not more readable up close. It's complex and stupid. And on top of that, there's all kinds of different APIs that exist. Like I said, there's local storage, there's window.name, document.cookie, Indexdb. There's a bunch. It's unfortunately a lot of people haven't really looked at Indexdb because of how complex it is compared to all these other more antiquated storage APIs. However, I really advocate for people to kind of go and check them out. In fact, if you think that syntax is gross, there's some good wrapper libraries that have come up in the past few years. Dexy is a really great example, where it almost gives you like a jQuery-like syntax for working with Indexdb. So you can have more feature-filled database-like structures where you can query it in a much more readable manner. Local forage, if you don't want to implement that 30 lines of code, you can actually have a local storage-like API within Indexdb using local forage. Nolan's project, PouchDB, is another great one. It actually will give you a full CouchDB database synced in your browser, and it works in a whole bunch of old browsers, and it works really, really well. You can have full databases synced from your server down to your client, completely working offline and everything. And it's not a lightweight, these aren't lightweight things. Like you can have an IndexDB library that is gigabytes in size with a G. Like in fact, I think on Mozilla, or sorry, on Firefox and on Chrome, you can use up to 50% of available disk space with proper permissions. If you want to check it out, there's this awesome thing called the Browser Storage Abuser, where you can go in there and ask it to say, I want to download like 16 gigabytes of random gibberish, and it'll fill your cache and fill your offline stuff with that, and you can actually see how much storage you can access. And so you can actually store full audio albums, full videos completely within IndexDB and have them available offline. Any kind of data that you could possibly want to have persisted to the client doesn't have to be just small string things that would be shoved in the cache. You can have these large objects. You can have them. It's the URL. If you want to check it out. It's really cool. And yeah, all those APIs are cool. And the thing, though, a lot of those things are still really complex. Even with those APIs, you have to be aware of all of the new features. And there's some parts of progressive web apps that are complex, like managing state and service workers or all these other things. But some of them are actually really easy to get into. One of the easiest things to start with is probably the web app manifest. It's a really cool spec. All it is a giant JSON file. If you ever developed a Chrome extension or an Android or iPhone app, you know what a manifest is. It's just a big object that lists a whole bunch of key value pairs for metadata about your application. Stuff like your name, the text direction, so if you're going to be prioritized for an Arabic area, a description, icons, just a whole bunch of metadata, right? And you can also include stuff like related applications. So if you happen to also make a native application, like your Gmail or something, you have a website that's really great, but you can also say, hey, we also have related applications, so that if a user ever opens the Gmail website on a device, we can check to see if they prefer native applications. If that's true, it'll just auto-pop it into that native application without the user having to do anything, or you having to do anything. And all you have to do to support this JSON file other than write it is just include this one link tag on in your HTML in your head, and it works. You can just pop it in there within all that other stuff, and it all functions automatically. And what's great is that because it's just a link tag, if you're using some old browser that doesn't know what the web manifest is, it does nothing. Like it's just a couple extra bytes to download, but otherwise there's not a problem. And one thing you might notice in a lot of this data, when I was going over all the different metadata that exists, is that a lot of that kind of already exists in this head tags. Like a lot of the description, the orientation, icons, that sort of thing has existed. And we've basically been slowly creating our own manifest-like file in our head document, the document head sections of our websites for years. And so rather than I want to make it as easy as possible for y'all to start making progressive web apps. So I created a node package called Manifestation, because I love stupid names. And all this is a node package that goes out and does all the heavy lifting for you. And so we will actually go out and create a whole bunch of little modules that tries to auto-populate every single one of the possible web manifest values. So if, for example, this is how we test for the language attribute. So we will load up a couple of files like Cheerio is like a server-side jQuery, and CLD is a compact language detection. It's a binary file that is the same algorithms that like Google Translate uses to detect corpuses of text and what languages they are. It's all scientific, and I know nothing about it other than what I just said. And so we load up that HTML, and we just check for the language attribute, and if that's there, that's great. If it's not there, we'll check for the XML language attribute, because some people set that for some reason. And if that's there, we'll actually check for the Dublin core, if any librarians are here, language attribute, because there are some websites that have that, and so we want to support as many websites as possible. And if all of that fails, we'll actually fall back to that compact language detection, where we will load the entire corpus of text on that website, and then try and figure out the dominant text that exists on that website, and then that was what we return. And this is one of the more simple plugins that we created for this thing. Like the icons one is like several hundred lines long, and it'll actually load all kinds of, like the freaking requires fill up the whole slide. And it tries to load every single icon you could ever possibly include, like the favicons, obviously, any kind of Apple Touch icon that's ever existed, the tile image that existed in IE10 for some reason, even the XML config that exists for the MS application config to load those things in IE10 if you ever made an Xbox app in 2011. Like basically, if you can define an icon, we will find it and we will add it to your manifest. And even if you don't want to install Node, that's fine. I created a stupid website because you should be able to do this really easy. So if you go to Web Manifest, you get this website and you put in your domain and you will get a pop-up and it will give you the entire Web Manifest. And so all you have to do is download that, put it onto your website, and you have the beginning of a PWA. It's awesome. You can also, I included a couple of cool little things if you want to check out the spec. Great thing about a lot of these progressive web app specs, especially the new APIs, is that it's still fairly early days, and as a result, you can actually control the direction of those specifications as a web developer. Most browsers are really starved for feedback other than, like, you suck. From developers, and it's something that a lot of developers don't realize is how much we value your voices. We want to know whether or not APIs work. I don't want APIs that we're designing today to end up in Mike's talk 15 years from now. Hopefully you're not giving the same talk 15 years from now. But anyway, it's really easy to get started in these things, and you can kind of just dive right in and add that. And like I said, it won't break anything. You can just ship it today. And what's cool about the manifest attribute specifically is that it actually kind of starts to act as to like search engines as a indicator of a progressive web app. And so you can imagine since we own Bing at Microsoft, we're actually going to start crawling the web looking for these manifest files and starting to try and figure out key indicators that mark something as a progressive web app. And when we find those things, we're actually going to start importing them into the Windows Store. This is obviously something you can opt out of if you're not interested, but this basically is a new marketplace that would automatically be created for any progressive web app that folks create. And so if, one of the largest operating system platforms on the planet, we have a lot of users. And so if our users go to our store and looking for an application that you built because it's popular, you can actually get it there without having to do a thing. Of course, you can take over that account and add all kinds of features to it after the fact, but this happens automatically just because you opt into these really simple PWA applications, early on. But, I've been on the web for a while, and whenever I initially heard the idea of sort of like automatically importing things or, like kind of favoring one platform over the other, like we would do in the store environment, I immediately just kind of had horrible flashbacks. And remembered all the ways of the terrible time in the browser wars and how browsers would sort of add features and compete constantly. And that sucked as a web developer. And it's not really something I ever want to go back to. But at the same time, PWAs are kind of a new angle to look at that at. You can have sort of the A in PWA are apps, right? Like we're in theory competing with native applications, and as a result, you kind of have to take into account different native platform features. Example, it could be like with Electron. It's just a wrapped up Chromium web service with a web application inside of it, but it's not exactly the same on every single platform in every single way. For example, when you ship it, you get an option of all the different types of ways to close an Electron app. Because when a user is using your application, they don't care that it's a progressive web app or if it's written in C++. They just want the app to behave the way they expect an app to work. So you have to have those native affordances. You have to start kind of hook into those native APIs in order to have those things work. And there's a bunch of different things that have been on the web for a while, some new, some old, that are these sort of more proprietary APIs, but that heavily influence the ways that standards-based APIs are eventually created. A lot of times standards APIs happen because one of the web browsers researched something in a basically proprietary manner because it wasn't open, it wasn't open standard at the beginning, and then they bring it out there, we figure out what was terrible with it, and we try and make it better, and then we ship it everywhere. And then sometimes there's stuff like, Safari push notifications has existed on desktop for I think like 5 years now. It's been around for a really long time. A lot of websites weren't using it. It's coming to mobile now where push notifications is arguably much more useful, but you can have it at a standards level, but at the same time, there was nothing stopping developers from engaging with push notifications at a really early time. You can figure out all the nuances of what makes a good push notification. When shouldn't you push a notification for years now? So that when it finally came to the mobile platform, so that when it's on all of our Android devices, hopefully coming to iPhone soon. It's coming to Edge in our next version. All these different platforms finally have these push notifications. You could have had a half decade, of experience with all these different crazy APIs and how to make them work. Another great example is like the payments API. Apple Pay came out on Safari the year before last at WWDC. And it's a really great experience for a user. I mean, the ability, if you've never used Apple Pay, I encourage you to check it out, because all you have to do is usually put your thumb over the little button, and then all of a sudden you just bought new sneakers, and it's great. And it's terrible for my wallet, but it works really, really well for most users. And luckily, this is actually coming to the web as well. Like Edge shipped a similar API last year, and it's basically whenever a user goes to a website that supports web payments today, in Edge, you automatically get this nice little pop-up. They don't have to enter any of their data into a form. It's all saved, so you click it. If you work in e-commerce, you know how terrible it is to lose people in your funnel, like all the different steps that you have to go through to build a form. And so you can have this feature, and it works really, really well. It's not only that, the web payments can be fairly straightforward to implement in certain situations. Like this demo right here was just a few lines of code. All you had to do was check for, set that this is a basic card interface, where it's basically just autofill for your data, all the different credit cards that you support. And then you set an object of the amount due, the value that it is, and then we, in this case, are also going to request shipping to make sure we get an address, so it's not like a donation of some kind. And then, just to start shipping it, all you have to do is check for the payment request in Window. And if it's there, you create a new payment request. And if it's not there, what's cool is you just go back to your old thing you're already doing already. Like you can start using these features at a really, really early time and actually influence the way a lot of them will work in the future. If you don't like the way APIs work, we can still change it now. We can't change it 5 years from now when they've all of a sudden been baked and there's websites relying on the old buggy behavior. In fact, it's been shipping in Chrome mobile for a while. It just shipped in Chrome desktop. Chris is going to go over some of the awesome stuff you can do with web payments in just a few minutes. But you can have these native-like experiences, the same kind of things you already have in native applications today. And so, like I said, the Windows Store is going to start auto-indexing progressive web apps on the web. And what's cool about that is that because of the way that we're preparing them and packaging them, you actually get full access to the WinRT APIs. So basically, all the APIs that native Windows applications work, you'll have access to within your installed progressive web apps. So that means stuff like Bluetooth. You have full Bluetooth device access, media keys, so like play, pause, fast forward, all that stuff, OCR, even Cortana, like the native voice assistant, can be directly linked into your progressive web app today. You can have that shipping, you can have it working on Windows, and it's obviously Cortana's not going to work on iOS, but you can have a more native experience on Windows. In the same way you can have a more native experience on iOS if you start using some of their APIs. Use these APIs early, and it actually affects what we as browsers implement later on. The whole point of all this is that you shouldn't wait for a re-architecture to start trying out these new things. You should just start trying it out today. Like, check out the new shiny stuff, and just make really cool stuff. So, cool, that's me. Thank you. Good. Yeah. Hey.
Hi there.
Hey.
Let's go over to those fancy seats.
Please.
Great talk.
Thank you.
You touched on a lot of different APIs.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could really give a talk about each specific individual API if you were.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there's so many things I want to talk about, and there's so many things that I want to talk about each one. But I like to sort of tell people all of the different APIs. There's thousands of APIs in the web platform, and hundreds of them are basically never used by a lot of people. And dozens of those hundreds are actually really useful. So you should explore, and check out new stuff.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what it is that you learned about SVG when you started to create this app?
Oh yeah,
Or
just
this
how to
you've
use
forgotten?
it. Luckily, like I was lucky enough to meet Sarah Sudain, who's like the SVG master. If you've ever tried to learn SVG, and she was incredibly kind in teaching me how to create a circle in SVG. And
Isn't it just circle?
yeah, no, I know you don't have to rub it in, but yeah, it's literally just a circle tag.
I'm messing with you.
Yeah, but most HTML isn't that simple. Well, SVG, XML. And you know, then I ended up using GreenSock to make all the animations work. That was the more tricky part. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about GreenSock before when we were mentioning animations API.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, GreenSock is phenomenal if you've ever done any kind of, if you've never done animation APIs, or if you're not an expert like Rachel, you can do some really, really impressive animations with GreenSock fairly easily. If you're an idiot like me, it's actually pretty easy.
I am. Yeah, you gave us some examples of PWAs that you made yourself. Are there any high-profile examples of PWAs that really like set the bar?
Sure. Like the mobile Twitter is a great PWA that's been shipping for a few months now. It works offline. Lyft, the car service. I don't know if it's in the Netherlands, but it's like an Uber service in America. You actually have the full ride share experience as a PWA. You can go to ride.lyft.com, and it's a full offline web app, and it has geolocation and all this stuff. It works great. It works really well.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for this amazing
absolutely.
talk. Yeah, give me a warm hand.
Thank you.